The sun burned like molten gold above the coast of Palestine. It was September 7th, 1191, a day that would carve its name into the chronicles of chivalry and war. In the distance, the faint shimmer of the sea met the endless horizon of sand. And upon that sand, two armies advanced, one bearing the cross, the other the crescent. The Third Crusade had reached its breaking point. Jerusalem was lost. Acre had been taken, but the road to the Holy City was long and filled with blood. And now, under the blazing sun, the armies of Richard the Lionheart and Sultan Saladin would collide in one of the most disciplined and ferocious battles of the Crusades, the Battle of Arsuf. Music rises, drums of war, faint calls of horns in the wind. They called him Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. Richard, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Lord of half of France. But titles meant little in the desert. Here, the only crown was the one in battle. He rode at the head of 12,000 men, knights in chainmail that glimmered like water, infantry hardened by endless marches, and the fearsome Knights Hospitaller and Templar at his flanks. Opposing them, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. To his followers, he was the sword of Islam, the restorer of Jerusalem. To his enemies, a phantom in the desert, striking, vanishing, and striking again. His army numbered close to 20,000, Mamluk cavalry, archers, and the elite guards of Damascus, swift as wind, deadly as flame. The two forces shadowed each other for days. Richard marched south along the Mediterranean coast toward Jaffa, his men shielded by ships that mirrored their movement at sea. Saladin followed inland, always watching, always waiting. He struck like a serpent, his horse archers swarming the rear, loosing volleys of arrows that darkened the sun. And yet, the Crusaders did not break. Richard's army moved like a machine, disciplined, relentless, unyielding. The infantry formed the core, shields locked, holding back the waves of Saracen arrows. Behind them, the Knights of the Templars guarded the rear. The Hospitallers held the van. Drums beat the pace. Horns signaled order. They moved step by step, always toward the south, toward Arsuf. The march was a torment. The heat blistered through armor. Water was scarce. Every cry of Allahu Akbar from the dunes echoed like thunder, followed by the hiss of arrows. Men fell. Horses collapsed. But the formation never faltered. Saladin's plan was simple: exhaust them. Break their discipline. He knew the desert favored speed, not steel. If he could provoke the Crusaders into charging too soon, their formation would dissolve, and his cavalry would devour them like wolves. But Richard was patient. He understood that victory in this land was not won by fury, but by control. At dawn on the seventh day, near the city of Arsuf, the trap was set. The desert shimmered. The Crusaders could see the outlines of palm trees, the promise of water, of rest. But between them and that promise waited Saladin's host, stretching across the plains in a crescent of death. The sky trembled with the sound of war drums. From every dune, banners of green and gold unfurled, the army of Islam assembled in full. Tens of thousands of hoofs thundered. The air filled with the whistle of arrows. Richard gave the order, hold the line. From the front to the rear, the Crusader ranks locked shields and raised their lances. The Templars formed the iron vanguard. The infantry, shields pocked with arrows, pressed close behind. And as the first wave of Saracen cavalry descended, the desert exploded in sound and fury. It was chaos, yet not confusion. Each charge was met with cold discipline. Men fell beneath hooves, swords clashed on shields, the cries of the wounded mingled with the chants of prayer. Still, the line held. Hour after hour, Saladin's horsemen swirled like a storm around them, never committing to full battle, always testing, harassing, retreating, returning. Their speed was unmatched, their archery devastating. And slowly, inexorably, the Crusader formation began to stretch thin. The Hospitallers at the rear were under relentless assault. Their horses foamed with exhaustion, their men begged to charge, but Richard's orders were absolute: hold. Wait for my signal. Then, the moment came. An arrow struck the Hospitaller commander's horse. He fell, blooded but unbroken. The Saracens surged forward, screaming victory. And in that moment of chaos, the lion roared. Richard spurred his horse forward, his banner rising like fire against the sand. He raised his sword, and the desert shook. The cry went up across the ranks, Deus Vult, God wills it. And the Crusader cavalry thundered forward, lances lowered, hooves pounding like the heartbeat of war. The charge of the Lionheart had begun. The Saracen front shattered beneath the impact. Lances pierced shields, swords flashed like lightning, and the once flawless crescent broke apart in chaos. Saladin's men rallied, circling, reforming, countercharging, but the momentum was gone. The Crusaders pressed forward, driving them from the field. By sunset, the plain of Arsuf was littered with the fallen. Thousands of men, Christian and Muslim alike, their blood mingling in the dust. And as the desert wind howled through the silence, one truth remained. That day, the lion roared in the heart of the Holy Land, and his echo would be remembered for centuries. The desert had turned red. For hours, the armies of Christ and Islam had fought beneath a sun that refused to die. Dust hung thick in the air, the smell of sweat, blood, and horseflesh clinging to every breath. The first charge of Richard the Lionheart had torn through the Saracen lines like a thunderbolt. But Saladin was far from defeated. He was no stranger to loss. He had seen men die in the thousands, cities burn, empires fall, and yet his calm never wavered. From a rise above the plain, he watched as his riders scattered and regrouped, like waves drawing back before another strike. Where another commander might have panicked, Saladin waited. He knew that victory belonged not to the first who struck, but to the one who endured. Richard's charge had been magnificent, but costly. His knights were deep in enemy ground, momentum fading, their horses foaming, their lines stretched thin across the desert plain. The infantry struggled to catch up, the discipline that had held for hours now fraying under exhaustion. And Saladin saw his moment. He raised his arm. A signal fire flashed from the dunes. From behind the hills to the east, a fresh wave of cavalry appeared. Mamluks, elite riders of Egypt, armored in dark mail and crimson silk. Their bows gleamed in the light of the dying sun. The Sultan's command swept through their ranks like wind through wheat. They began to encircle the Crusaders once more. Richard turned in the saddle. He saw the movement, understood it instantly. Saladin was closing the trap, cutting his knights off from the infantry, seeking to isolate and destroy them before they could reform. For a heartbeat, chaos threatened to return. But Richard was not a man to retreat. He wheeled his horse around, the banner of the cross whipping behind him. His voice, hoarse but commanding, cut through the din of battle. "Rally to me. Form the line. No man stands alone." The knights obeyed. In the swirling dust, they gathered, shields locking once again, lances set. Templars and Hospitallers side by side, English, Flemish, and Norman banners rising from storm. The Lionheart rode at their center, his sword flashing in the last light of day. The Saracens charged, a black tide of hooves and arrows. They came from every direction, the earth trembling beneath their advance. Arrows rained down like a storm of iron. Men fell screaming, pierced through mail and flesh. Still, the Crusaders held. Richard gave no order to advance, not yet. He waited until the enemy was close enough to smell the sweat on their horses. Then, he lifted his sword. And the lion roared again. The second charge was smaller, tighter, more controlled, but every bit as lethal. The knights thundered forward, their formation a wall of steel and faith. The shock of impact was catastrophic. Saracen riders were crushed beneath hooves, thrown from their saddles, their lines shattered like glass. The Crusaders cut through them, broke their rhythm, shattered their momentum. For a moment, victory seemed absolute. The Muslim ranks wavered, dust rising in great golden clouds as men and horses collided. Richard's standard, a white cross on a blood-red field, surged forward, glinting against the setting sun. But then, the counterstroke. Saladin unleashed his hidden reserve. From the south, another formation appeared, his guard of Damascus, silent, disciplined, untouched by the chaos of the day. They moved like shadows, sweeping around the flank toward Richard's exhausted knights. It was a maneuver born of genius, a reminder that Saladin was as much a tactician as a warrior. He did not seek to win by brute force, but by patience, precision, and timing. The Crusader charge slowed. The horses staggered. The knights were surrounded once more. In that desperate hour, Richard fought not as a king, but as a soldier. He dismounted, dragging his sword through the sand, leading men on foot into the fray. His armor was dented, his face streaked with sweat and blood, but his eyes blazed with the fire of command. Wherever the line threatened to break, he was there. When a knight fell, Richard stood over him. When the Saracens pressed close, he struck them down with brutal precision. They said later that even Saladin, watching from afar, marveled at his courage. "He is truly a king," the Sultan murmured, "and a lion among men." The battle raged for hours more, each side refusing to yield. The Saracens, though fierce and swift, could not shatter the Crusader discipline. The Crusaders, though few and weary, could not break the endless tide of Saladin's cavalry. When the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon, neither army could claim the field. But the silence that followed was not defeat, it was exhaustion. As darkness fell, Saladin ordered the retreat. Not a rout, but a calm, deliberate withdrawal, the mark of a commander who knew when to preserve his strength. His men faded into the dunes, vanishing like smoke, their banners melting into the night. The Crusaders did not pursue. They stood among the dead, surrounded by the moans of the dying and the whisper of the sea. Their armor glowed faintly in the firelight, their banners tattered but unfallen. And in that haunting stillness, Richard removed his helmet. The wind from the sea cooled his face. He looked toward the horizon where Saladin's army had vanished and whispered, almost to himself, this was no victory, but it was not defeat. For though the Crusaders held the field, Jerusalem still lay beyond their reach. Arsuf had been a triumph of will, not conquest, but it proved one thing beyond doubt, the Lionheart could not be broken. That night, both kings tended to their wounded. Saladin, in his tent of green silk, prayed beneath the crescent moon. Richard, by the shore, washed the blood from his sword in the waves of the Mediterranean. And though they were enemies, both men shared the same thought, that they had looked into the heart of the other and seen a reflection of themselves. The night after Arsuf was heavy with silence. The desert, which only hours before had roared with fury, now lay still, a graveyard of men and horses, steel and broken banners. Smoke drifted across the plain, thin and ghostly in the moonlight. Everywhere, torches flickered among the dead. The battle was over, but the war was not. The Crusaders camped near the coast, their backs to the sea. They had held the field, the ultimate proof of discipline and courage. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of men lay dead or dying, and the survivors, though triumphant, were hollowed by fatigue. Armor clinked softly as soldiers moved through the dark, searching for the wounded, offering water, whispering prayers. Among them walked the Lionheart. Richard's armor was dented, his hands bruised and blooded, his face streaked with sand and sweat. He said little. He stopped often, kneeling beside the fallen, Templar, Hospitaller, Archer, Knight, it did not matter their rank. He looked upon each face as if memorizing the cost of the day. He had won, but it did not feel like victory. To the south, beyond the dunes, Saladin's army withdrew in silence. It was not a rout, but a measured retreat, a testament to his mastery. He had lost perhaps 7,000 men, but his army was not destroyed. It would live to fight another day. In the cool of the desert night, his campfires burned like stars across the horizon. Saladin sat alone in his pavilion, his armor laid aside, his mind sharp and restless. He had tested Richard's strength and found it formidable, the discipline of iron, the leadership of a true king. And though he had failed to crush the Crusaders, he had also denied them their ultimate goal. Jerusalem was still his. He smiled faintly, not from joy, but from understanding. The war between them was not just of swords, but of endurance, will, and faith. Each had proven himself worthy of the other. Each knew that the coming months would decide not just the fate of kingdoms, but the fate of legends. At dawn, Richard's camp stirred again. The wounded were tended, the dead buried in shallow graves. The banners of the cross still fluttered defiantly in the sea wind. And then, the march resumed. The road to Jaffa lay open. With the Saracens scattered, Richard advanced southward, reclaiming the coastal cities one by one. The army moved slower now, the heat and loss weighed on them, but morale burned bright. The men whispered the name of Arsuf like a prayer. It had become a symbol, proof that the Lionheart could face the might of Islam and endure. Yet even in triumph, the king was haunted. He knew the truth, that Saladin's strength was far from broken. The Sultan's army was vast, his resources deep, his knowledge of the land absolute. Every mile southward, Richard felt the desert itself resisting him. And in his heart, he began to understand, Arsuf had been a battle of survival, not conquest. Historians would later write that Arsuf marked the turning point of the Third Crusade. It was not the capture of Jerusalem, but it restored faith to an army on the brink of despair. It silenced doubts, unified commanders, and reminded the world that even in the heart of a hostile land, courage could still shape destiny. For Richard, the victory brought prestige beyond measure. Messengers carried the news to Europe. The lion has roared in the Holy Land, and the crescent has trembled. But the king himself was unmoved by glory. He wrote to his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, that the land was a sea of endless struggle, and that he had seen more death than any man should. Still, he pressed on. By the autumn of 1191, the Crusaders reached Jaffa. The city, once in Saracen hands, fell swiftly. Its capture secured the coast, a vital step toward any assault on Jerusalem. And yet, the closer they came to the holy city, the more the dream began to fade. Winter approached. Supplies ran thin. Saladin's forces harassed them day and night, striking supply lines, vanishing into the dunes. The Crusader army, though victorious, began to fracture under exhaustion. Low choir rises, mournful and grand. Saladin watched from afar. He did not need to destroy Richard. He only needed time. For every mile the Lionheart marched, the desert took more from him: water, men, strength, faith. And so the Sultan turned to a new weapon: diplomacy. Through envoys, he sent messages of truce, of negotiation, each one respectful, almost courteous. Saladin understood that respect could be a sword sharper than steel. Richard, ever the warrior, found himself drawn into this battle of words. He admired Saladin's honor, his refusal to desecrate prisoners, his chivalry toward the fallen. In another life, he thought, perhaps they might have been allies. But in this one, they were destined to be opposites: the cross and the crescent, the lion and the eagle, bound by fate. By early 1192, both men were exhausted. Years of war, heat, and loss had drained even the greatest of kings. And so, on a field outside Ramla, their envoys met once more. This time, the words would end what swords could not. The Treaty of Ramla was born, a fragile peace that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem, but left the city itself under Muslim control. It was not the victory Richard had sought, but it was a triumph of honor, a peace forged between warriors who had come to understand each other. When the treaty was signed, it is said that Saladin sent Richard a gift: a horse, swift and strong, with saddle and bridle of gold. And Richard, in turn, sent the Sultan a jeweled sword. Two kings, enemies by faith, bound by respect. The Lionheart would never see Jerusalem, but he had carved his legend upon the sands of Arsuf, a testament to courage, strategy, and the spirit of chivalry. And Saladin, though his empire endured, would forever be remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a man of grace, mercy, and vision. In the end, neither truly won, but both transcended the age they lived in. In the heart of the desert, amid blood and sand, two kings met, not as beasts, but as men who understood that greatness is not found in conquest, but in how one faces the storm. The sands of Arsuf had long since cooled, yet their memory would burn for centuries. The plain where steel had clashed with steel, where knights and horsemen had fought under a sun of fire, became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol, a testament to courage, strategy, and the eternal tension between honor and ambition. Richard the Lionheart returned to Europe a hero, though not the conqueror he had envisioned. Tales of his bravery spread like wildfire, from the castles of Normandy to the streets of London. Bards sang of the day the Lionheart charged into the heart of Saladin's host, breaking waves of cavalry like they were made of paper. Chroniclers wrote of his discipline, his patience, and the courage that refused to bend beneath heat, arrows, and death. Yet beyond the applause, Richard carried the weight of what Arsuf had cost him. Thousands of men, English, French, Flemish, and Italian, had died under his command. Knights he had trained, men he had led, were now dust upon the desert wind. And still, the crusade did not achieve its ultimate goal. Jerusalem remained beyond reach, a prize untouched. Saladin, too, returned to his lands with lessons engraved deep in his mind. The Sultan's reputation as a brilliant tactician was cemented by Arsuf, but he also understood the valor of his enemy. Richard had shown a type of warfare unfamiliar to the desert: disciplined formations, coordinated charges, and an iron will that could resist exhaustion and chaos alike. It was not merely a battle, it was a masterclass in leadership, and one that would influence generations of soldiers and rulers. Across the Mediterranean, the echoes of Arsuf shaped the imagination of Europe. Knighthood, already a rising ideal, found in Richard's actions a perfect example of chivalry in practice. Courage tempered by wisdom, aggression balanced with discipline. Stories of the Lionheart and the Crescent spread beyond mere chronicles. They became legend. The battlefield itself, littered with weapons and banners, became a place of reflection and awe. Pilgrims would later journey to the region, not merely to pray, but to witness where history had been written in blood and sand. Historians would call Arsuf one of the greatest tactical victories of the Crusades, not because it secured territory, but because it demonstrated the power of leadership, unity, and strategy under the harshest conditions imaginable. Yet Arsuf was more than a military triumph. It was a bridge between worlds. Richard and Saladin, though enemies, shared a mutual respect that transcended religion and politics. It was the beginning of a rare chapter in history where honor could temper the brutality of war. Even in their rivalry, both kings exemplified qualities that the medieval world revered: courage, restraint, mercy, and foresight. This legacy shaped diplomacy as much as it did battle. The Treaty of Ramla, negotiated months later, owed much to the mutual understanding forged at Arsuf. Though Jerusalem remained under Saladin's control, Christian pilgrims were allowed passage, and a fragile peace endured for decades. It was a compromise born not from weakness, but from respect between warriors who had tested each other to the limits. In the courts of Europe, Richard's reputation as a warrior king grew, inspiring a generation of knights and leaders. His campaigns were studied by tacticians for centuries, a benchmark in the art of combining infantry and cavalry, of discipline under fire, and of timing decisive charges with surgical precision. Arsuf became a case study: patience versus impulse, strategy versus instinct, courage versus caution. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, Saladin's legacy was equally profound. He emerged from Arsuf as a symbol of unity and resilience. He had faced the most disciplined army of Europe and preserved his kingdom. He had demonstrated that strength could coexist with mercy, that honor could survive even amidst relentless warfare. To the people of Syria and Egypt, he was not only a sultan but a moral exemplar, a man who balanced power with conscience, conquest with justice. Arsuf also left its mark on the cultural memory of warfare. The battle illustrated that leadership was more than courage. It was judgment, discipline, and the ability to inspire men in conditions where all reason seemed lost. The Lionheart's patience, the Sultan's cunning, and the endurance of thousands of ordinary soldiers made Arsuf a story not just of kings, but of human will. It became a legend whispered in castles, written in chronicles, painted in illuminated manuscripts, and retold by poets seeking to capture the essence of heroism. And yet, history is never kind to the fallen. Men whose names were never recorded died in sand and blood, their stories lost. But their courage endured, etched into the collective memory of their nations. Arsuf was their testament, as much as it was the tale of kings. Today, scholars still analyze the tactics employed that day. The Crusaders' disciplined marching columns, the strategic placement of cavalry, the calculated charges under the desert sun. These were lessons not just in war, but in leadership. Military academies across the world would study Arsuf for centuries, extracting principles of command, morale, and timing. Yet the true legacy of Arsuf was something deeper than strategy. It was a story of restraint amid chaos, of respect between enemies, of the humanity that could persist even in the most brutal of circumstances. It reminded the world that even in war, honor could exist, and that sometimes the greatest victories were those of character rather than conquest. The Lionheart would continue his campaigns, the Crusade would persist, and Saladin would continue to defend his lands. But Arsuf remained, a beacon of strategy, courage, and the enduring drama of men shaping history under a merciless sun. Generations would speak of the lion and the crescent, the desert that roared with battle, and the day when the world witnessed the meeting of two titans. And in that meeting, the desert whispered a truth that would never fade. Greatness is forged not in the absence of struggle, but in the heart of it. The roar of the lion echoes still, in history, in legend, in the sands of Arsuf. The roar of the Lionheart's charge had faded, but the echoes of Arsuf were carried in the hearts of those who had survived. History often remembers kings, sultans, and banners, yet the true story of battle lies in the men who bore the weight of steel, sand, and fear. On the Crusader side, the knights were the embodiment of medieval valor. The Templars, sworn to defend Christendom, rode with unwavering discipline. Their white mantles, marked with the blood-red cross, shone in the sun like beacons of faith. Among them, Sir Robert of Normandy, barely 23, had never faced a battle of such scale. Yet when the Saracen cavalry pressed upon his flank, he rode forward with a courage that would be sung of for generations. Each lance thrust, each sword swing, was a defiance against the desert itself, a stand for honor, faith, and comrades beside him. The Hospitallers, too, carried the weight of reputation. Sir Hugh de Payens, older now, scarred from previous campaigns, led his men with calm authority. He had seen men fall under his command and understood that survival required more than bravery. It required patience, coordination, and an unyielding sense of duty. When arrows darkened the sky and the cries of wounded pierced the air, Hugh's voice rang clear: "Hold the line. No man dies alone." It was this discipline that kept the Crusader column intact even under the relentless pressure of Saladin's attacks. Richard himself was not merely a king, he was the spirit of the army. Every knight who faltered found renewed strength in his presence. Every man who feared the desert, the arrows, or the hooves of death saw courage reflected in the eyes of the Lionheart. He did not ask them to fight for glory, he demanded they fight for each other. And in that bond, the Crusaders found invincible strength. Across the dunes, Saladin's men were no less remarkable. The Mamluks, born of rigorous training and discipline, were the lightning of his army. Mounted archers, quick as the wind, they struck with precision, disappearing before their enemies could retaliate. Among them, Emir Al-Kamil, a captain of the guard, moved like a shadow. He had faced the finest knights of Europe and knew that brute force alone would not win the day. Every maneuver, every feigned retreat, was executed with the skill of a man who understood both men and horses as extensions of his own will. The infantry of Saladin, though often overshadowed in legend by cavalry, bore the brunt of the Crusaders' charges. Foot soldiers from Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo fought in tight formations, using shields and spears to protect one another. They fell in droves, yet their courage never faltered. Many of these men were farmers, artisans, and merchants before the call of war drew them into the desert. Arsuf transformed them into warriors whose names history might never remember, but whose actions shaped the outcome of the crusade. And then there were the leaders whose fates intertwined with the battlefield in moments of fleeting yet unforgettable human drama. Richard's close companion, William de Longchamp, fought with unmatched loyalty, riding alongside the king, warding off arrows and rallying knights whose courage wavered. Every scratch upon William's armor was a testament to the close brush with death that defined Arsuf. Yet he did not flinch. His faith in Richard was absolute, a bond that would carry them through the trials to come. On the Saracen side, Salah ad-Din himself was not removed from the battlefield. Though he did not ride at the front like Richard, he observed every movement, issuing commands that saved his men from annihilation. At times, he dismounted to confer with commanders, pacing the dunes with eyes like fire, assessing, calculating, predicting. His presence was a quiet force, a reminder that leadership is not only in the sword but in vision, patience, and clarity under pressure. And then there were the soldiers, young men who had left homes in Europe, Syria, and Egypt. Some had never held a sword before the crusade, others were seasoned fighters hardened by prior campaigns. They faced death with trembling hands and pounding hearts. Yet in those hours, they became legends. The infantry of Richard, standing shield to shield, endured volley after volley of arrows, maintaining formation when every instinct screamed to flee. The horsemen of Saladin, darting in the sun, struck with lethal efficiency, teaching their opponents the deadly ballet of mounted warfare. Stories arose later of individuals whose courage bordered on myth. One English archer, pressed to the dune's edge, held his position despite being surrounded, felling enemies with a relentless precision that saved his company. A young Saracen horseman, barely 17, maneuvered through chaos, drawing Crusaders into traps that demonstrated both daring and cunning beyond his years. These men were the invisible threads that wove the fabric of Arsuf, each life, each death, a stitch in history's tapestry. Even in the darkest hours, small acts of humanity persisted. A Crusader helped a fallen comrade, carrying him from the line of fire. A Saracen officer spared a wounded knight, offering water before disappearing into the dunes. In the midst of slaughter and chaos, these moments revealed the enduring bond between men who understood the fragility of life in war. By the end of the day, when the sun dipped low and the banners of the Crusaders waved over the plain, both armies had been tested beyond measure. Richard, standing amid his knights, looked upon the bodies, the blood, and the sand, knowing the victory belonged as much to the men beside him as to himself. Saladin, observing his remaining forces regroup, acknowledged silently that his warriors had fought with unmatched valor, and that one day, their skill and courage would shape the future of the region. History may have immortalized the kings, the banners, and the decisions of strategy. But Arsuf was a story written by countless hands, the men who charged, the men who defended, the men who fell. Their bravery, their fear, their humanity, these were the true legacy of the battle. The Lionheart and the Crescent would meet again in letters and treaties, in tales and songs. But it was the soldiers behind the banners who carried the day on the sands of Arsuf, who embodied the spirit of courage and endurance that would echo for centuries. And so, The desert remembered. Not only the roar of kings, but the heartbeat of men, ordinary men turned warriors, whose courage shaped the destiny of nations, and whose stories, though often unnamed, would live forever in the memory of Arsuf. The roar of battle had faded, yet the sands of Arsuf still whispered of thunder and fire. The Lionheart had proven his courage. Saladin had demonstrated his resilience. But the story of war does not end with a single day of combat. It flows onward, like a tide, reshaping the land, the people, and the fate of kingdoms. After Arsuf, Richard advanced toward Jaffa with renewed momentum. The Crusaders' march was slower now, burdened with the wounded and the dead, yet their spirit burned brighter than the desert sun. The city of Jaffa fell swiftly, opening a vital foothold along the coast. It provided supplies, shelter, and a base from which Richard could plan further campaigns. Yet he knew that Jerusalem remained distant, heavily defended, and politically complex. Victory at Arsuf had been tactical. The ultimate prize still required patience, cunning, and diplomacy. Saladin, from the south, did not rush. He assessed the Crusader movements, reinforcing strategic positions and harassing supply lines. The Sultan understood that time was his ally. Every day the Crusaders lingered in the desert, their numbers dwindled, their morale tested. He did not need to strike immediately. He needed to endure, conserve, and exploit weakness. The months following Arsuf were a chess game across the Levant. Skirmishes erupted along the coast, with both sides testing defenses, gauging strength, and maneuvering for advantage. Richard continued to lead from the front, demonstrating the same bravery that had earned him the name Lionheart. Every charge, every calculated engagement, was a demonstration of discipline and strategy, a testament to the lessons learned at Arsuf. Saladin, meanwhile, used diplomacy alongside war. He sent envoys to negotiate safe passage for pilgrims, exchange prisoners, and maintain the delicate balance of power. His respect for Richard, earned on the battlefield, shaped these interactions. Both kings understood that outright annihilation was impossible, and that honor could sometimes be the strongest weapon of all. Arsuf's impact reached far beyond the battlefield. In Europe, news of the Lionheart's success inspired knights and nobles, rekindling faith in the Crusade. Templar and Hospitaller orders gained prestige, and tales of courage spread through courts and monasteries alike. The strategic brilliance of Richard's maneuvers became a case study for future military leaders. Discipline under fire, the coordination of infantry and cavalry, the timing of decisive charges, these principles would echo through history, shaping warfare for centuries. In the Islamic world, Saladin's reputation was equally enhanced. He had survived the onslaught of Europe's finest knights, preserved his army, and maintained the integrity of his territory. Arsuf reinforced his status as a leader who combined martial prowess with wisdom, mercy, and foresight. To his people, he became more than a commander. He became a symbol of resilience and justice. The Treaty of Ramla, signed months later, reflected the lessons of Arsuf. It was a compromise. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, yet Christian pilgrims could travel safely. Both sides recognized the limits of power and the value of negotiation. In this way, Arsuf was not only a military victory but a turning point in diplomacy. The respect forged between Richard and Saladin prevented further immediate bloodshed and allowed both to preserve their legacies. Yet war, like the tide, never truly ceases. Richard would continue campaigns along the coast, pressing his army forward, balancing ambition with the realities of desert warfare. Saladin would continue to defend his lands, adapt to new threats, and maintain the unity of his empire. Both men knew that history would remember not only their victories but also their honor, strategy, and humanity. The men who fought at Arsuf, knights, archers, infantry, horsemen, carried the lessons of that day forward. They returned to Europe, Syria, and Egypt, their stories inspiring future generations. The battlefield had been a crucible, forging courage, endurance, and discipline in every soldier who survived. Arsuf's legacy endures not merely in maps and annals, but in the timeless qualities it revealed: the value of patience under pressure, the power of discipline, the necessity of courage tempered with wisdom. It showed that even amid chaos and death, leadership, honor, and humanity could prevail. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, the Lionheart gazed across the sea. He understood that history had witnessed something extraordinary, a meeting of titans in the heart of the desert. And across the dunes, Saladin reflected in his pavilion, knowing that both men had shaped each other's destiny as much as they had shaped the world around them. The roar of the lion, the crescent of the Sultan, the countless voices of men who fought and fell, all converged in memory. Arsuf was more than a battle. It was a lesson, a legend, a testament to the enduring spirit of mankind. The tides of war continue to rise and fall, but the story of Arsuf remains eternal. A day when kings tested their courage, armies tested their discipline, and men tested the limits of endurance. A day when the desert itself became a stage for heroism, strategy, and honor. A day that would echo through the ages.